Hello. So yeah, thank you for coming. I think you're very good to come on a sunny evening. I expect most people are actually out in their allotment and gardens today. So thanks for coming. Um, so I'm going to just run through what is relevant to this part of the year, and talk. We can talk about the season's harvest, how it's gone, successes and failures. If you've got any uh, questions that you want to ask, any troubleshooting of any problems, then it's good to say. And then we need to go over how to, oh, I've got somebody else in the waiting room. We need to go over how you're actually going to store those things that we've grown and make sure that they're not wasted. Because there's sometimes quite a lot of crop to be dealing with as well this time of year. And then we can move on to preparing the plot for the winter, which will be really helpful for anybody that's just starting to grow vegetables now, and what we can start planting and sowing now, ready for next year. We'll just finish off with a little bit of information about leaf mulch, because that's a very good autumnal job. And if we want to share recipes, then there's facilities to do that as well. Okay, so there we go. Oh, lovely. So welcome to Simon, and we've got somebody else coming as well. I've got experience on my own allotment, but it's not going to be a wide ranging as combined experience. So if you want to offer a different opinion as we go along, if you feel like something else has worked and I haven't mentioned it, then please feel free to ask questions and interrupt and things like that. It makes it for a lot nicer talk, I think, if we have a conversation rather than me rambling on too much. So yeah, feel free to interrupt, and you can raise your hand as well if you have a question. So this year's harvest then. These are actually last year's peppers in this picture because my peppers haven't gone red yet. So is anybody else growing peppers? If you want to raise your hand, there's a reaction at the bottom of the screen. Can't see anyone. I'll just carry on. So if you've grown peppers, they do freeze really well. So if you have an abundance suddenly, you can just chop them up. We didn't bother blanching them or anything like that, and just open freeze them, and you can put them in bags, and then you can add them to your stews and bolognese and anything else in cooking that you use your peppers. Same with tomatoes. I really like storing tomatoes in the freezer. I tend to skin them and chop them and put them in pour and store bags. But also you can dehydrate them using a dehydrator. And that means that they're slightly smaller volume. So if you've only got a small freezer, then that helps to store more. Hi, Anita. Yeah.
I have a tomato question.
Yeah.
Because I've got loads and loads and loads of really tiny little tomatoes. And what I did really well last year was to like roast them with olive oil and a bit of rosemary and stuff. So they go quite small and quite intense, and then freeze those. Do you ever do that?
Nice. Yeah, no, that sounds lovely.
It's
Like a
really
faster
good.
way of doing sun-blushed tomatoes.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I've done them in a dehydrator before. I've got Excalibur dehydrator. I don't use it enough really, but it sort of makes them smaller and then they rehydrate in cooking. And when you haven't got lots of freezer space, it's really valuable, isn't it, doing that? You can also bottle tomatoes. You've got to make sure that the bottles get hot enough and that it's sterilised, otherwise they can go off, and it's such a shame if you lose your tomatoes. Has anyone done bottling before? Tomatoes are getting blight at the moment. Unfortunately, I know 2 neighbouring allotment holders that have got blight now. It's really important to chop off leaves that aren't needed by the plant. So as they grow, then take them off from the bottom up, and they'll start looking a bit yellow and kind of rubbish. just take the leaves off, and that increases airflow in a greenhouse or polytunnel. That's really important to stop blight. Also make sure that they're not touching the ceiling, because the ceiling can get condensation that then makes the leaves wet, and then that can encourage blight. And keep your doors open constantly until we have a risk of frost, because having that airflow day and night is really good for preventing blight. And if you see any like the sort of classic black splodge on a stem of a plant or a leaf or a fruit, I normally see it on the fruit first actually, then it's probably time to cut your losses and take all the green fruit off. What we do if we do have blight is take all the green fruit off, either with gloves or without, and then when you start doing the rest of the tomatoes, don't touch the rest of the tomatoes with the tomatoes that you've harvested with the hands that you've touched the plant with. So if you've been handling the leaves with gloves on and you know that it's been blighty, just take your gloves off before you harvest the tomatoes, because it's a fungal spore and it's more likely to go on a plant. But you can put them in a spare room to ripen. So you can make green tomato chutney, and you can cook with green tomatoes as well. They're just a bit tangier. They still make tomato sauce. But if you want to let them go ripe, you can just leave them somewhere. It does take about a month or so, and you've got to check them. But if you take them off early enough, you're more likely to have them go ripe than if you leave them on and then the whole crop gets infested with blight. Any questions on blight or tomatoes at all? Okay, so aubergine wise, I've had a particularly bad year, I think, for aubergines. I don't think it's been sunny enough. I've got one at the moment that's a nice size, and a couple more coming, all on the same plant. And then another 2 plants that I've got have just been all flowers and no fruit so far. So I think it's probably not the best year for aubergine. I've heard that from a couple of different people.
Helen, sorry to interrupt. I think that...
You've muted yourself, Anita.
Yeah, sorry, I think that John has a question maybe about blight. Would you like to take yourself off mute, John?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I don't know how well my mic will be, but is there a way that we can prevent blight at all? I've lost both of my plants this year.
Right. Yeah, you can buy blight resistant tomato varieties. That does actually help. I really like Furline F1, which is a Ferline, which is blight resistant. Sun Gold are supposed to be blight resistant, but they're not as good as Furline. I've had blight on the Sun Gold, been able to take those out, and then not got them on the Furline. And when sometimes people offer you plants, and I've had like, whatever plant, I think Black Russian was the last one I got off somebody. And I really quite often find that the people that give me plants and then they get blight. So I've actually stopped growing other varieties, which I suppose is a bit narrow-minded, but I also really like the ones that I'm growing. So why take up the space with something that hasn't worked in the past? So I find that really helps. The thing where you're cutting the excess leaves off really helps. Grow cordon types rather than bush types. Cordons, you just basically grow one tall stem and you pinch out the side shoots. When you've got a bush plant, they're much more lush with their growth and they're quite confusingly green, that it's the density of the leaves that means lack of airflow. So if you've got a plant that you can have as one stem and then cut the leaves off from the bottom, you get much better airflow. And basically the whole aim of the airflow is to try and stop them getting wet, because if the leaves get wet, that's more of an attraction for blight. So outdoor tomatoes, I've never had success with. They've always got blight. I've heard people having more success with outdoor varieties if they have, say, a bush type or something like that, that's a small cherry that ripens early, so before it normally comes around at late August, early September, and they have them in a garden that's quite far away from other people growing tomatoes. So I think on an allotment site, you've got much more cross wind and everything that's maybe taking it from somebody else's plot. So yeah, growing them indoors loads of ventilation and different varieties. I hope that's helped.
Yes, it has. Thank you.
Brilliant. Did you have yours outside or inside?
Both of them were outside.
Right. It was probably this they got wet that would have done it. Right. So any other questions about tomatoes or peppers or chilies or aubergines? Okay, I'll move on to cucumbers. I haven't got a nice picture. I didn't want to put too many pictures on because sometimes if you do too good a slideshow, you don't get so many questions. So I was really enjoyed my cucumbers this year because I grew outdoor ones and they weren't as prolific, because sometimes if you grow them indoors, you get millions of cucumbers and sometimes it's a bit too much. I can't think of any real way to store a cucumber. I think you've just got to eat them fresh, haven't you? So sweet corn, I think I've got a picture on the next one. Sweet corn, I'll come back to cabbage in a minute. Sweet corn, I find it really hard to know when it's ripe. I don't know about anyone else. It takes a lot of looking almost every other day. The tassel at the top that you can see in the right hand picture is meant to be completely black, so that might be why this one wasn't ready, because it wasn't completely black, but I wanted to check it. So I peeled the leaves back and I could see that the corns weren't yellow, leaving it on the plant. So apart from actually looking at the corns, I don't know any surefire way of really telling without looking that they're ripe. You can put your finger in the corn as it gives some milky appearance. But I know that all my sweet corn's probably going to be ready when I'm on holiday, because it always is. But it is really good to freeze. And it's not as hard to take off the corn as you'd imagine. If you just have a sharp knife, keep the little stick that you break it off some of the plant, you end up with a little stick to hold on to. And if you keep that and run the knife along the corn, you can actually get the corns off relatively easily. And then put them in the freezer, like blanch them slightly and put them in the freezer. So is anybody else growing corn? Got any questions? Okay, I'll just move on then. So storing crops, damp sand. I think I got it wrong one year and did dry sand. It does help if it's damp. So all your root crops you can store in damp sand. They probably still want to be in a shed or somewhere cool and dark. Parsnips I do tend to leave in the ground. I do sometimes cover them up with black plastic so they don't get too wet, because if they get really wet for a long time, I think that might cause canker. But you can also get canker resistant ones. That's when they kind of rot on the crown. I think that's normally something that's going to happen over winter when they're getting too wet. So a bit of black plastic sheeting I do find helps the carrots to stay nice, basically. And I suppose really if they're in the ground and the ground isn't too damp, it's like being in damp sand, isn't it? It's more well drained, it's not as claggy. I find if you leave celeriac in the ground, they just get full of slugs. And carrots, I do tend to either eat them, or if you've got a pot of carrots and they haven't finished yet, you feel like there's still some carrots that are little sprouts and things, if you put them in a greenhouse or a polytunnel, then they can actually grow more over the winter. So I do that if they're movable. So in the freezer we've got the things that we were just talking about. So full beans rather than the haricot beans. I wouldn't recommend putting haricot beans in the freezer. It changes the taste and it's not very nice. They taste, so you have to have a really spicy stew to disguise the taste. So I wouldn't freeze haricot beans again. Bottling, I've got no experience with. Has anybody got any experience doing bottling you want to share? It's an old-fashioned technique where you basically cook the vegetables, put them in the jar, seal the lid, and then put them in boiling water or an oven or a pressure cooker to basically, it's like canning, but using a bottle. So you do have to get really sturdy bottles, but really helpful for not using a freezer. And I think it's something that we should probably reskill ourselves with, because people were doing it in the war, and I think we've lost it in the last sort of 50 years, the ability to do that, and I think it's quite important. Dehydrating, yeah, I got quite into dehydrating a little while ago because I got dehydrator. I think I've got it on the next page. Oh no, but I tell you what, I think I can go back. So this is the normal way that you dry beans. You can either pick them off the plant when they're already dry, or you can lay them on some blotting paper or kitchen roll for a little while and they dry themselves. So beans you don't need to put in a dehydrator, but that's what I've got. And it's a big old unit. I've actually shared it with my mum because it's bigger than a microwave. You need a bit of storage space and we don't have the storage in our house. So we did it as a joint Christmas present to each other. Yeah, good for different fruit. You can make fruit leathers in there, dry nuts and tomatoes and things like that. So yeah. So any questions on what we've done so far, please just put your hand up and shout as we go. Potatoes, you need to dry the skins and kind of dry the mud and everything rather than taking them straight out of the ground and putting them in a paper sack. So you've either got to pick a dry sunny day and leave them outside. I normally, if it's outside, I'll leave them in the morning. I do it in the morning, leave them for a couple of hours and then turn them over after lunch and dry the other side. And when they're dry, you can brush off the soil much easier without damaging the skins, and store them in a bag. But don't wash them before you store them because the soil actually does help to keep them fresher for longer. And you want to be putting them in a paper bag or a like Hessian sack that's got airflow, but never plastic. And they ideally want to be stored at about 5 degrees. I find that it's a bit tricky when you haven't got a massive house to know where to store them. The best place I think in our house is probably the attic, because if you think about it, you insulate above your top ceiling, but then the roof then makes it insulated against the cold. So it's not going to freeze up there, but it's not going to be warm. And so actually potatoes, cabbages, pumpkins, things like that do store really well in the attic. But the problem is if you ever have a cat bring in a mouse, then you've also provided a lovely load of food for a mouse. So if you have mice in your house, then that's not good. I've never, there's somebody else just coming. So yeah, has anybody tried a clamp? I've got a picture here. Never tried it myself. Seems like something that's just going to attract rodents, keeping this outside, but this is an old-fashioned way of storing root crops, and you just basically hide them in straw and earth, almost underground, and you have these little drainage channels to prevent them getting waterlogged. I think it's a very old-fashioned way, but maybe we should look at that. Anybody ever tried anything like that? Hello. We've got a new, so my thing says internet connection unstable. Please let me know if I go bitty. So chicory is more like something that you're going to harvest through the winter. So has anyone grown chicory this year? Well, what you do is you sow the seed in the spring. You grow a plant that's very much like a dandelion. It has a really big taproot like this. And then you wait until later on in the year. You can actually, if you take all the green leaves off, you can compost them. You might find some blanched ones right in the middle at the end of the summer. And they're really a lot sweeter. They haven't got the bitterness of the outside leaves. But the idea is to actually cut off all the foliage and store the roots in a plant pot full of soil or compost, in a cupboard or something indoors, completely excluded from light, and you get these chickens forming. And I must say, it is really quite lovely going to a cupboard in December and picking fresh leaves. It feels like really satisfying. But the first year we did it, we got some green fly in our cupboard, and then I was banned from keeping them inside by my husband. So I think they might have come in with the soil. So just a word of warning. If you've got a garage, obviously things like green fly aren't such a problem in there. But yeah, really nice vegetable to try actually. Really easy to grow. They're about as easy to grow as dandelions, so pretty simple. Okay, so on the talk notes that we've got some recipes for various things, and they are some of the pickles that we've got there. If anybody has any nice recipes for jam, chutney, things like that, then do let us know. You can like email community.ttw@gmail.com and let us know if you have any recipes you want me to include. I think the one that we're doing mainly at the moment is beetroot, just pickled beetroot actually. There's I think we just found a recipe online. You put a little bit of sugar in. I didn't put as much as the recipe asked for because I try and reduce my sugar, but you basically cook the beetroot fully, peel them, slice them, have heated jars. You put your hot sliced beetroot in the heated jar. You have your vinegar that's heated up on the hob with some spices in and things like coriander and whatever you want. And you pour the hot vinegar in the hot jar on the hot beetroot, seal the lid, and then you'll get the pop as it seals, and it will keep for some time, and it's ready to eat after a couple of weeks. I think it's better to eat your beetroot like now rather than leaving it too long, because if you leave it too long, it starts getting a bit bitter. So if you see that the leaves are starting to go a bit like not as nice looking, not as green, then that's a sort of indication the plant's starting to die. So just cut the foliage off and pickle the beetroot that are left. I have left them in the ground quite a long time in the winter before, and they get a little bit of green on top, and sometimes they're still fine to eat. So can you think of any vegetables that you've grown this year that you want to ask a question about, you've had a problem with, or you don't know how to store? I think we've got some questions in the chat, I think. Is the no-cook apple chutney recipe eating or cooking apples? I will have to look. It's on the main notes. It's actually right at the end, so I should be able to flick through. It's not actually my recipe. It was donated by somebody else. I find it hard to believe you don't have to cook something that's a chutney, but they gave me a jar and it was very nice and it didn't kill me, so I'm sure it must be fine. So it's a deviation from an Indian recipe from the days of the Raj, apparently. Makes 10 1-pound jars, and you have 900 grams of cooking apples, peeled and cored. I watched a lovely video actually today showing somebody fermenting. That's another way I haven't actually. I'll do the pumpkin in a minute. I haven't actually tried fermenting because it uses salt and the action of bacteria to store the vegetables, and the bacteria is meant to be really good for your stomach. And this video was saying how she actually grows more things for fermenting than worrying about growing things too early in the spring, because she's still eating the fermenting products. So I thought that was a really interesting way of continuing the harvest through the hungry gap in the sort of April, May time when your stored things have maybe been eaten. So I must look at fermenting, I think, next year. So can you recap how to store pumpkin and squash? So pumpkin and squash store really easily. You basically, when you harvest the plant will get mildew probably. Mine always do. At a certain time of year, they just die. They've done their thing, and you end up with all the foliage dying, and you can see your squashes and pumpkins dotted around. So preferably harvest them when they're like properly ripe, but if they're a bit underripe and you want to harvest them, then they are okay. And use a pair of scissors to cut so that you've got the stem that comes up from the pumpkin, and then that's on a stem of the plant, so cut so that you've got a little bit of that stem attached to the other stem that's attached to the plant. So it looks like a T bar. And that just basically stops rot from happening from the top. And then just dry them off, make sure they're not covered in mud or anything like that. And they store in a cool, dry place. So again, the attic was the best place for them. But as long as I haven't got too many, I must admit, I've just put them on my kitchen worktop. They look quite decorative, and they've been fine there. They're all okay in the shed, but you need to protect them from frost. But yeah, they store well. I've eaten squashes from the previous year up to May the next year. What happens is the seeds ripen from the inside and it goes more and more pithy, and you end up scraping out more and more seed, but you still end up with pumpkin left, even going into May. So how do you know when the squash is properly ripe? I think mainly from the colour. It's if you grow the Chicory ones or whatever, you know, the blue Hubbard ones and things, then they're meant to be a blue colour, and they're just a bit pale first. So really it's from the colour. They want to be like an even colour of ripeness on the outside. Butternut squash kind of go from an anemic colour to a more nutty brown kind of colour. My wall is behind me really. So yeah, I'd go with the colour. So any other questions? Okay, so celery. So which type of celery did you grow? So you said you grew celery this year, but it came out tough and bitter. So was that self-blanching celery or trench celery? I can imagine it might have been self-blanching. I'll carry on assuming that it is. Can't remember, got it from the garden centre. Okay, I mean, basically trench celery, you have to really dig a trench and plant it at the bottom and exclude light from the stems. So when you buy shop bought celery, I don't know exactly how they grow it, but they are somehow excluding the light from the stems. And because it's generally trench celery that you buy. Sometimes it will be organic, but it will be fed a lot of water, and it will have grown quite quickly, and that's what makes it tender and not bitter. It's the lack of light that makes it bitter. So when you grow celery on your allotment, you tend to grow self-blanching types. It's good to pack them relatively close together, and by close together, probably 15 centimetres or so each way, maybe 20. So they're relatively tightly packed, and they exclude light from each other by their own leaves. So you'll find the ones that are further into your patch are paler. But I would say that they're still green. They're still too bitter really to eat fresh. I'm not really all that keen on celery anyway. So I don't really mind the fact that it's like cooking celery basically. So I just say that that's probably what it is. If you can work out how to do trench celery, if you really like to eat it raw, then there are things online that show you how to do it. You can wrap it in newspaper. You can grow it through a tin can. I just found that when I did that, it got eaten by slugs, I think because it was harbouring the slugs in the thing that I was trying to shelter it with. Okay, so John, you got a question?
Hi, yes. Beetroot I absolutely love beetroot. And this year I literally just got a jar, cooked the beetroot, and pickled it. I haven't tried it yet, as it's still doing its thing. But my question is, I bought beetroot in shops before. Obviously shop things are a bit different, but I like them being in the bag where they've just been able to sit in their juice and just, you know, be absolutely perfect. Is there any way I can replicate that at home?
I think probably the closest is going to be bottling. So basically a lot of these processes that they've got in the shops, they've sealed the air from it and they've heated it up. So with beetroot, it's going to be sealed in a plastic packaging. With cans, it's sealed in a tin, and with bottles, it's just sealed in a bottle. So I think that's probably going to be the thing that you need to do. So I don't know what the fluid would be that you would have around it, because you've got things, I think it might be called brining, but that would make it salty, which isn't like in the shops. So I mean, I would maybe research bottling online and see if you can find a recipe that doesn't involve vinegar or salt, but I don't know whether you would. But it's, yeah, there might be something out there that's using maybe apple juice or just water or something like that in the solution that they're kept in, that wouldn't affect the flavour quite so much. But yeah, I'd go down the bottling route for ease. So we're not likely to get vacuum packed machinery at home.
It does seem like it's just water, like the water that you've just cooked it from, if you know what I mean.
I expect they're probably vacuum packed. So they're probably cooked, because they are cooked, aren't they, when you get them? So they'll be cooked, skinned, and then vacuum packed. I don't know whether they'll be heated again to get rid of any bacteria or not, but it'll definitely be something in a factory setting, won't it?
Okay, thanks.
Okay. So T, have I said your name right? Really agree with you. The old ways of storage are well worth investigating. We've been trying some of the old preserving techniques, particularly with salt. Example, carrot and cucumber relish. It's a bit salty last year, but certainly kept well and got better. Chutneys can be endlessly good too. Yeah, definitely. I think that's been my experience as well with my friend's sauerkraut has been too salty. But looking at this video today, it didn't look like she was using that much salt in quite a large vat. And also she had a fermenting kit that had a lid and a little, like, you know, when you have wine and you have a demijohn with the little bubbles and the little wiggly gadget that you put on top for the gases to escape. It looked like she had a big fermenting thing that had that on it. And I was quite interested in that because she had a lot of beans that she was doing. And I don't know about you, but I get sometimes carrier bag fulls of beans at once, and then none for ages, and then loads at once. And yeah, it'd be nice to be able to store beans in a kind of fermented way, I think. So yeah, I'll investigate that. If I figure it out, I'll share it. But if you do as well, then I'd love to hear from you. Okay. Right. Any other questions? Not at the moment. Feel free to stop again. I'll just carry on because I have a tendency to overrun. I want to try and not do that today. Okay, so preparing your plot for the winter can also be seen as preparing your plot if you've just got it as well. So if you're new to it, then you might find you're taking over somebody else's allotment, or it could just be your own. So essentially, we know winter has frosts and rain and everything like that. And so any structures that you've got, then just make sure you take them down so they don't blow down, and store them in the clean and dry. It's pretty obvious, really. I find that if you store bamboo canes horizontally, they're more likely to get tube nesting bees in the end. And if you've got bees in the end in spring, which can be sort of April, May time that you're thinking about putting your bean structure up, and then you've got bees in there, then I always feel like I want to buy new canes because I don't want to disturb the beans. So we sort of store ours at sort of 45-degree angle or upright now, just to try and prevent that. Because if I want bees, I'll put them in a bee hotel somewhere else. So that's my tip. So the main thing that I see people doing on other people's allotments is digging the earth in the autumn and then leaving it bare. And that's quite an old-fashioned technique. The reason why people do it is because it possibly uncovers the slug eggs for birds to pick out. It's the rain and the frost is supposed to act on the soil and break it down into a fine tilth. I don't ever find that really looks like a fine tilth, even if the rain has acted on it. And that's soil erosion. So the earth doesn't like to be left bare like that. The only thing in nature that will turn over the earth and leave it bare are pigs, like wild pigs. And they have a benefit in the ecosystem for providing a habitat for pioneer weeds. for other things like turtle doves to eat, which is great in an ecosystem. But in our allotment, we don't want to provide the best environment for weeds to grow generally, because it just gives us more work to do in the spring. So if you want to save yourself some work in the spring, and also protect the soil from erosion, leaching of nutrients, then covering the earth in some way is the best policy. So there's 3 different ways, say, of doing this. You can use a green manure, you can use a sort of plastic sheeting mulch or a cardboard, and you can use compost and manure, and you can kind of use a combination of those as well. So a living mulch or green manure is where you sow some seeds now, they grow a plant. The plant will either stay completely alive over winter, in which case you sometimes have to then get rid of it in the spring, or it will die with the frost over winter and sort of dissolve back into the soil. I like the no-dig method. So in the past, the main thing that I've used is Phacelia, because it is frost tender. In some winters when it hasn't been very frosty, it has survived all winter. It needs successive frosts to kill it. So you get some protection for a while. And then when it gets to the point where you can see it's not protecting the soil anymore, I put black plastic sheeting over it. And I use the same stuff that I bought about 13 years ago. It hasn't degraded, so it's definitely not single use. I'm getting a lot of use from it and it's very helpful. But there are loads of other sorts of green manures you can grow. Phacelia is good because it germinates late. I've tried buckwheat this year, and that's germinating and growing pretty quick. So I wouldn't be afraid to sow it now. I'm not sure what it says on the seed packet, but buckwheat seemed pretty good. Field beans will survive over the winter. So what I do with those is cut them off at the base, because they're like beans, so they're quite easy because they've got one stem. So I just cut them off at the base. I'd compost the tops when I want to use the soil and leave the roots in place. Leaving the roots actually in the soil is a benefit because they hold nitrogen in the roots with nodules, so it feeds the next plant. And also, as the root degrades, it leaves a channel in the soil and actually helps to lighten up your soil. So we've got a question. We've got a new allotment on clay and have dug over half of it, but it doesn't seem suitable for any type of sowing. Too clumpy and clayey. Sand or gravel to break it down. So if you're going to add any, what would you call it, hard mineral stuff to a clay soil, the only thing you can use is a hard, coarse grit, because if you use sand on clay, what gaps you have in the soil will be filled with the sand, and it actually makes it worse. So don't put sand on a clay soil, but like a coarse grit. But the quantity of grit that you need to actually make any difference to a clay soil is a lot. And there's a real environmental impact to that, because it has to be mined and shipped and carted around. So I'd actually recommend compost for a clay soil, and a lot of it. And if it's really heavy and really heavy clay, then okay, dig it in, rotivate it in or dig it in. I wouldn't generally recommend digging, but to lighten up a clay soil is really helpful. But just getting as much humus as it is in there as possible, and it really makes a difference. Our soil at our allotment was pretty clayey when we got there, and it's made a massive difference having years and years of compost on there. The compost that we've used is municipal compost. It's quite dry and a little bit kind of twiggy, but in a very small way. And I think that helps to break up the texture of the soil. And it's also relatively cheap in comparison to other things. They call it organic. I'm not sure it has no chemicals in it at all, because it's from garden waste normally, but probably not that many chemicals. They have certified it organic anyway. and you can get it by the dumpy bag. You used to be able to collect a trailer load from Taunton, and we used to get half a ton at a time and put half a ton on probably a bed that was about 20 foot long by about 5 foot wide, so about sort of 4 inches thick. And we rotivated it in the first couple of years before I knew about no dig, but I think that really did help with the clay. You can do no dig on clay, but it takes longer, and using the green manures a real help, because their roots will go down and aerate the soil for you without having to dig. Things like fodder radish are particularly good. They're a large root, and they really break up the soil, but you should leave them in really to rot. So it sort of takes your soil out of action for a bit during the spring if you're doing it over winter. But I think with a lot of things, it's a sort of war of attrition, isn't it? You keep doing something. As the soil gets better, you won't have to dig it, even if it's heavy clay. But actually, when you dig, you disturb the layers of the soil. There's lots of bacteria that are supposed to be in the top or supposed to be a foot down. And if you dig, you kind of disturb the balance. It takes quite a while for it to get back. And you break up the mycorrhizal fungi that helps to transport nutrients around from other areas. So if you can avoid digging, then that's good. But I can appreciate if you've got really heavy clay, then that's not always the easiest thing. Okay. Does that answer the question? Anita?
Sorry, just wanted to check with Ty whether he's happy with that answer, or is there anything else that he wanted to ask, because he's put something in the chat which I don't know if you've had a chance to have a look at. Yeah. Ty, is that okay? Do you want to ask anything more about that? Oh, okay.
Just going to break down the clumps. I mean, a heavy rake, if you're just literally breaking down, you want to break down heavy clumps, then I'd just use a heavy rake to bash it.
Great. Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Right. So, yeah, green manures. So, some of these do grow over winter, and then you have to do cut and. When are we able to do this? As in the green manures, some you can sow now. So field beans you can sow in September. It depends what the weather's like. So winter tares I would still sow now. Some of these ones that say August, I mean, if you did them really soon, it's pretty much August still, isn't it? And the weather's still warm. I think it depends on the year. So we have our seasons, I think, are getting longer or just different. So I think sometimes it's always worth having a go. But yeah, I mean, Phacelia and field beans are your easiest ones to go with this time of year for success. But yeah, I've put these pictures on the slide to show how pretty they can be, actually. And I'm actually I think I'm gonna dig up a bed that was, it has some roses and lavender and cottage garden plants in, which the bees like, but I'm not getting any produce or effect from it. It's just pretty and nice for the bees. So I'm thinking about putting these green manures in and then maybe rotating that bed between the other beds, because the bees are still going to like the flowers that are on the green manures, and then they'd actually have a functional purpose in the allotment as well as part of the rotation and improving the soil. So I think I might try that. You only have so much space, don't you? But I think I might give it a go next year, actually doing a selection of things, because I've always done Phacelia before. But this time I've sown a patch of Phacelia, fenugreek, no, not fenugreek, buckwheat, winter tares, and something else. Might be one of the clovers. Red clover, I think. Crimson clover, that was it. Because if they have different sorts of roots and heights and depths of roots and different ones fix nitrogen and others don't. So actually having the combination, it's another kind of polyculture, which is generally better for nature and the soil. So, okay. So is that all right for green manures? When are you able to do this? Does that answer the question that there's different ones that are for this time of year, and the Phacelia and the field beans are probably the easiest? So I'll carry on. Let me know if you want me to stop. If you've got any other questions, that's fine. So an alternative to a green manure is literally just a normal manure or compost. So you can mulch with something that's already rotted, and you don't have to dig it in. So unless you've got a really horrendous soil, just lay it on the top. And what will happen over the winter is the worms will come up for it. They'll eat what they need and then they'll go back down again. And this aeration of the soil is done by the worms. So you need to look at your rotation of what you're growing next year to decide whether you're putting compost or manure on. So some people would have come to the previous talks, and you'll know the rotation that I do. So I always start with potatoes. So potatoes first, they want manure. They don't have to have manure. If you're vegan and you want to have compost on everything will be fine with compost. It's just that manure can be quite often quite cheap. We can get a massive 4-loader full for a tenner and it's delivered for our allotment. So I do quite like manure. And it's also, good food for different creatures, like different bugs and things. So you can put manure on potatoes. After potatoes, you put beans in that rotation. So the next one, and I always compost beans because beans sometimes need liming. If the leaves start looking a bit yellow to start with, it could be that they're slightly lacking in lime. And manure is slightly acidic. So I always keep a year between and just to compost for the beans. Brassicas come after beans. Brassicas don't like manure at all. They don't like the acidity, they don't like the clagginess. They much prefer compost for it to be light and airy in the soil. It prevents club root. And then after brassicas, it would be your roots. So you'd manure or compost leeks and onions. And you wouldn't put anything for parsnips or carrots because it makes them fork. So that's a really simple rotation. Pretty much everything else can just fit in where it fits. If you sort of go, oh, there's a patch there, then it's fine. Just try and keep an eye on it, keep a notebook, and just don't put the same stuff in the same patch every year. So I hope that sort of makes sense with the rotation. But yeah, just you harvest your crop, leave the roots in the ground. Sometimes you'll be lucky enough to get something growing from that root in the spring and give you some early greens. And just put your manure or compost on top. So that's fine. You can just do that. You could put a layer of cardboard underneath your compost and manure or on top, I suppose. And that would exclude a bit more light. But I really like black plastic because it's easy. I know that everybody doesn't like plastic these days, but the carbon that you're saving from growing your own veg is massive. So if it takes something that's maybe not perfect to make that process easier and you're more likely to continue and grow more and have more success, then I feel like it's a really decent payoff. But if you don't want to use plastic, then cardboard does do it as well. So the advantage of covering with plastic, I'm going to skip through these words. I think I might skip that and show you one of my mulches from last year. So this is Phacelia that I've covered up. Now, once the point where this Phacelia died down too much and it wasn't protecting the soil anymore, I covered it up with the black plastic, and you can see the the toads in here that are hiding underneath. They do like the conditions. There's worms, literally, you can see them when you lift the plastic off, making their holes going up and down. And you can I just raked off the stuff and put it in the compost bin. But you can see by this picture on the bottom left where the plastic was and where it wasn't. So you see the greenery that's growing everywhere else. It's really nice when you come to the spring and you can just rake the surface of the soil and plant into it, rather than sort of arduous weeding before you start. So yeah, I would recommend that. Can I go back? I can't seem to work out how to go back. No. But there are reasons for putting that protection on the soil. If you put it on after a decent amount of rain, don't put it on after a dry spell like it's been now, but put it on after it's rained and a good amount. If you lift it off in the spring and it's in a drought, you'll have damp soil underneath still, which is another really nice advantage. Yeah, so that or cardboard is a good thing. Cardboard will take about 6 months to rot, so if you put it on now, then put your compost and manure on top. By the time you get to spring, then it will be rotted enough that you can plant and sow into. So any questions on mulches? Because I think we've covered the three, haven't we? The rotted mulches, the green mulches, and then the cardboard or plastic. Just to mention as well, because I didn't say, is the plastic that I use is black, and that excludes the sunlight. If it's white or green or something like that, then it doesn't exclude the sunlight, and that means that the weeds can grow underneath. You can also use compost bags. That if you've got a bag of compost, they're normally black on the inside, so you can just use those and do little patches, and you reuse those bags. Okay. Right, just pop any questions in the chat or let me know if you want to have any questions. So if you're doing the no dig method for the first time this year, the main thing is you don't want to stand on the bed once you've decided where you're going to not dig. You don't want to compact it with the weight of yourself and your footprint. So just make sure that you've earmarked where your beds are. I really like just straight beds in lines. I think it makes me feel organised or something. So the bottom picture is like what our allotment is. You don't want it more than 4 or 5 foot apart, wide, because otherwise you can't stretch over and then you'll be tempted to walk on it. But you can also do it if you've got a fence in the background. If you can see my cursor, it was top picture. If you have a fence here, then obviously having the path right up to the edge is taking away some growing space, so you can do little keyhole ones, just so you know where you're standing. Okay. So, I mean, you can dig if you want, if your soil's really compacted, or like T was saying, heavy clay. But yeah, once you've dug it once, just don't stand on it again, and you shouldn't have to dig it again. So this year I was trying to be a bit more purist with my not digging, and so I did potatoes in a completely no dig way, and then another crop next to them in a how I'd always been doing them. So instead of digging a trench for my potatoes, I just do a little trowel hole and put them in the bottom of the hole. You don't need to dig a massive trench just to plant a potato. So that, I would say, is minimal till. You're not digging for the sake of it. But when I earth them up, I'll use a draw hoe and use the soil and the mulch on top to make the mound. Now, I'd read that you could use rotted bark chipping or compost for this. So I tried it, and it just falls down. It doesn't make a ridge. So I think actually I'm going to go back to my sort of half no dig and using the draw hoe to make the ridges. And you can, in that circumstance, actually not dig too much to take them out and just pull them out by hand. Whereas doing the no dig, completely no dig ones, I found the soil wasn't as friable to actually do that. So I had to dig. So I think actually doing them the way I was doing before is actually better. So the guy who invented the no dig system, or he didn't really invent it, but he's promoted it recently, Charles Dowding. He said he wishes he hadn't called it no dig. He wished he called it just minimal dig or something, because people are afraid to do any digging at all. And of course, you've got to dig out some things, like you've got to dig out your parsnips and your leeks. So it's really sort of minimal till, not digging for the sake of digging, which some people get into the habit of doing, turning soil in the autumn. Okay. So things that we can actually plant now. Yeah, John, what do you want to ask?
I just wanted to say about potatoes. I've been growing them in tubs and they work really, really well in tubs. And I found they work better in tubs than I do the ground.
Excellent.
Might be worth a try.
Yeah. Do you put one potato in each tub, or do you put a few in each one?
I always give it a go with a mix and match. Sometimes I just put one spud right in the middle of it. But I think 2 is a good size, really, if you want a good medium sized potatoes. You know, any large ones, and I think the idea is the less you put in, the bigger the potato. If you want more medium size, put more potatoes in. If you want really small ones, you could put 3 in.
And that gives you control as well, doesn't it? Especially with new potatoes, because it's nicer if they're smaller, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So do you put them in and then put more compost in the top as they grow?
A lot of the time I literally just put them in and just fill the bucket up to the top. And then it seems like they do just fill the bucket. This year has been quite bad, I think, for potatoes for me, and they've just stayed at the top of the tub and not really gone down. I don't know why that is. The year before, they did go the whole way down and fill the tub.
Yeah, because they grow in between the seed potato and the leaves. Yeah. So yeah, like if you're doing it the same way, how is it different one year? It's weird, isn't it? I don't think it's been the best year for potatoes either. I think it might. I'm not quite sure whether I got blight on my potatoes for the first time in 16 years, but I did take all the tops off and take them down the dump. Before I didn't want to risk leaving them and then find out it was blight, because it travels down the stem. But I mean, that's unusual for me. They're normally a bit better. I think it was probably wet at the wrong time and then dry at the wrong time or something like that.
Yeah, potatoes have just been terrible again, just like tomatoes this year.
Yeah, what should we plant now then? If we've been taking out some things and there's some space, then there should be some room to start planting some more things. So overwintering broad beans are a really popular one. If you're actually keeping them outside, you don't really want them much bigger than this picture, where they're sort of 2 inches or so before any potential snow. So you don't want to be planting them now and then leave them out and they're like sort of really long, and then you get a winter snow and they just all fall flat. So if you're wanting them to be taller, then you probably want to put them in a greenhouse or something. But I gave up growing broad beans because I decided I didn't like them. So I expect I probably haven't got as much experience as some of the people here at growing broad beans. We did grow them successfully. I just haven't grown them for a while. Has anybody got any tips on broad beans? I think the main thing that I found is they do need staking in the spring when they get a bit taller. And if you actually don't grow them over winter, you can grow them in pots on your windowsill about sort of January. And plant them out in like February, and they're okay as long as you harden them off. So if you do sow them and then they get eaten by mice or something, then you do have another chance to make it up. And last time, I think it was in the spring talks, we got a tip from somebody that said about putting holly leaves in the trench where they do peas. So I'd imagine that'll work for broad beans as well. Keep off the mice. Okay. So carrots, these were my surprise carrots that I had last year from just putting this sort of, I wasn't sure whether it had any carrots left in it, pot in the polytunnel. But if you've got blight now, I would definitely recommend trying carrots, because it's nice to have a benefit from having a clear polytunnel. And this time of year, if you sow carrots now, you can be eating them at Christmas. And because we have managed to successfully not get blight for a few years, I haven't been able to put my carrots in the ground in the polytunnel because I haven't had space. So I've actually missed it. So yeah, it's always nice to feel like you've got a benefit from a problem. So yeah, I would definitely recommend growing carrots. And I think you can pretty much grow any type you want, really. We tend to grow Autumn King or Nantes. I think I'd probably plump for Autumn King because you kind of imagine that they might be a bit hardier against the cold. You can go with whatever you've got. If you've got some seed left over. And if they're looking a bit stunted and they're not growing very well, you could put a bit of fleece on them if it's really cold. But I think most of the time they just don't grow because of sunlight. And if you can do it now rather than October or November, then you'll get a much better crop than if you had to wait until October or November. Yeah, my top tip for carrots. But I think I'll just bring in any that are having containers outside again because that works. Overwintering peas, I wasn't really all that keen on, to be honest. I grew them and they were just really starchy, and I'd rather wait until the peas are really lovely and sweet. But I think it's one of those things that if you were hungry, you'd eat starchy peas, wouldn't you? But I think really the pea shoots are much more pleasant, just growing them on a windowsill. Has anybody else grown or overwintering peas and would like to say that they're lovely instead of my experience? It makes sense, doesn't it, that with more sunlight that they'd be a bit sweeter. And to put peas up against something that they can grow up, doesn't matter what time of year, it's the same principle. So overwintering onions, I think they're the Chinese type, the Chicory or whatever they're called. I can't remember what they're called. But yeah, you can grow onion sets and have them over winter. I found that I haven't had a lot more success putting them out over winter than I did just planting them in February, because February is pretty early as well. But I think maybe if you had a polytunnel or a greenhouse and had some space, then they could be worth it. Especially if you planted them on the side that should be aubergines next year. They're likely to finish doing their thing before the aubergines happen. And then they'd be less likely to get affected by too much water in the winter. I think that's the problem that I found with my overwintering onions, is they've kind of just gone a bit rotten in the winter and not grown very well. But yeah, so if you're wanting to do overwintering ones, then you can look for the Japanese, that's all, not Chinese. Okay. I actually really like growing my onions in modules first and then planting them out, because they have a tendency to be eaten by birds. So these little things at the end, these little bits of last year's leaf, get pulled out by birds, I think, because they think it's a worm. And sometimes they actually push themselves out by their roots growing. So if you put all your sets in module trays, and it doesn't even have to be the best compost, it can be something that's sort of secondhand out of a pot or something, and wait until they've got a root on them, and then plant them out like a plant, half in and half out of the soil still. I think they just work so much better. Actually thinking about that, I've just realised that I didn't try that method with the overwintering onions. Maybe if I had, then they would have been more successful. I've only ever done that with the spring ones. That could be a good idea. Garlic, you plant actually in the ground, whereas onions you plant half in and half out, because they need the room to expand. So if they're buried underground, they don't have the room to expand quite so much, and they're not strong enough, like a potato is strong enough to push the soil apart. But a garlic does get planted a bit further in, and also they need the frost. I've planted garlic in, I'm trying to remember when I got my first plot. It must have been the first time I had an allotment. We didn't get the allotment until January, I think, end of January. And I planted the garlic probably in February, and it mustn't have frosted after that. And you end up with one big clove. It's quite fun, but it's a lot of garlic to use in one meal. So it's the frost that makes them divide into cloves. So yeah, it says that they don't need as fertile soil, but I have grown really good garlic in a fertile soil. So I think with everything, it likes a bit of nutrient. But they're quite nice in flower beds. If you're growing at home and you want to sort of scatter them around a flower bed, then they're quite attractive plants, as long as you're able to actually get a fork in and dig them out when they need it. I had to put this picture of Vanessa in because she looks so happy. But yeah, I love that. So Chinese cabbage and pak choi. British cabbages are probably a bit late to sow now. Savoys and even January King. Is it January King that's a cabbage? I think it is. You really need to sort of sow them around the summer solstice, like July, and then plant them out probably as plants in August. If you ask at a garden centre, they may have some plants that you can plant out now, and might be just early enough to get a good crop. Purple sprouting should be okay, because even if it's quite a stunted plant, then you'll still get some purple sprouting. It's when you've got a cabbage that needs to heart up and actually have the time to heart up that it's more difficult. That reminds me, on the first slide I showed my red cabbages. That picture was actually taken in March, end of March, and they were the cabbages that I had stored from the previous year. So next year, when you're choosing your seed, if you choose white and red storing cabbages, if you like cabbage during the winter, they do store really well, and they can be kept in the shed as well. And when it gets to March, what's happened is the stem starts growing a little bit, and the outer leaves will probably be pretty manky. You take the outer leaves off, where they've basically, the reason why they've gone bad is because they've detached from the core. Take those off and you'll have a lovely cabbage underneath. So yeah, if you like cabbage in the winter, next spring think about growing some winter storing ones. They do take a bit longer to grow though, they're not so fast. But Chinese cabbage and pak choi is good to sow now. They grow really quick, and they're really good in a polytunnel or greenhouse as well. So again, if you've had blight, you've got a choice of carrots, pak choi, overwintering onions, so you don't have to have a wasted space. And leaves as well. So leaves are good over the winter. I really like this winter density cos here, but you can get cut and come again lettuce leaves as well. In the middle of the winter, they don't grow very fast. They really slow down. There's not enough sun, there's not enough light. If we have an unusually warm December, obviously they'll carry on. So sometimes it's worth having a go just to see what happens. But if you don't want to be going down the allotment in the middle of December and January, and you actually just want to wait for the spring, actually lettuce is one of the earliest things that you can start. So you can sow them in February and start them early on. So if you want to not worry about that January, December time when they're growing really slowly, then just wait until afterwards. But yeah, it's nice to make the most of the space. Okay, so I think, as far as I can remember from my slides, that's the end of talking about vegetables. So has anybody got any other questions or ideas of what you can sow now, or harvest questions or anything like that? Feel free to put up your hand or write in the chat, whatever's quickest. If you want to put up your hand, then do. Okay. So winter is the time of year to plant fruit, particularly trees. Sometime around November, December is probably better than January, February, because it's actually less likely to be snowing. I think we generally don't have as hard soil that time of year, and it also gives the trees time to settle in before the rain, rather than putting them in just before it gets dry. So they like to be sat with nice sort of damp roots and are happy outside in the winter. So fruit bushes are quite happy if you dig some compost in the soil or lay lots of compost on top. Fruit trees, don't go digging a big load of compost into a hole because it makes the roots not want to go down. They need a good tap root. So just plant them in the ground and put mulch on top. And that actually works better with the no dig method as well. So fruit bushes are also fine with that. So yeah, you don't have to put all your nutrients in the soil. That's how trees normally work, is their leaf litter and animal poo lies on the surface, and then it goes into the soil with rain and the action of nature. So they're used to having things lying on the surface. That's how nature would normally work. Blueberries, yeah, lovely, blueberries. So blueberries need two, somebody's just asked a question. Sorry, I sound like I'm talking to myself. How do you get blueberries established? So first thing is you need two bushes. I don't think they're completely, I think they're slightly self-fertile, but not very. You're not going to get a very good crop if you have one bush. So definitely make sure you have two. They need two things. They need an acidic soil and they need damp soil. So if you're planting them in the ground, you want to really have one of those. Otherwise, you're fighting against nature. We've got an allotment that's on a slope, and at the bottom of the slope, we're literally on the water table in the winter. You can put a spade in the ground and it's water straight away. So we know that the soil is already wet down there. Any of the other places we've planted them in, sort of community planting around Wellington, is wet. Might not necessarily be that acidic, but it's already wet. So you're 50% there. If you're not acidic, you can dig a hole and mix in ericaceous compost. Now, ericaceous compost, most of the ericaceous compost you get in the shops is peat that's actually been made less acidic, crazily enough, to make it the exact right thing for a pot. So if you're going to go for peat, you might as well just go for just straight peat and not ericaceous compost. But really, we don't want to be doing either of those things, because peat bogs are really precious natural habitats, and they're also keeping a lot of carbon locked in the soil. But you can get ericaceous compost that isn't peat based now. And there's a company called Dalefoot Compost that sells it. That's DALE Foot Compost, and they're in the Cotswolds, and they make it out of bracken and sheep's wool. It's a bit more expensive, but then the sacrifice for the natural habitats were, not worth the cheap cost or anything. So if you get, I would say 3 bags per plant, and dig a hole and put as much of the ericaceous compost in the hole as possible, sort of providing your soil's normally a bit wet as well. Otherwise, you'll have to water it a lot. Yes, thank you, Anita. Anita's just put Dalefoot compost in the chat. They're a really good compost, actually. I found that the texture was better buying it in the summer and autumn than it was too early in the year. It had a bit of a rough texture this year, which in February, which I was a bit sort of disappointed with. But all the other times I've got it, it's been absolutely outstanding for potting and everything else. But yeah, if you're growing in a pot, obviously you can regulate. You really need to make sure you water properly. I'm useless at pots. If it's not drought tolerant, then it's going to die. Hopeless at watering pots. But if you've got a small space and you're good at watering, you can put blueberry in a pot and you can put ericaceous pot compost in there. They also like having an annual watering with diluted apple cider vinegar, which helps to freshen them up. There was a couple of plants that's been in the ground for 14 years, and the blueberries have got smaller and smaller, and we've started watering them with the apple cider vinegar this year, and it's freshened them up, and they're really good this year. I think also because it rained a lot in the right time of year for them to plump up. There's also other things that you can do to keep the soil acidic, because it will go back to how your natural soil is over time, because the acidity is actually something to do with the bacteria in there. So there are solutions, and I think it's sulfur or something that you can put sulfur chips on the surface. But yeah, I mean, I think sulfur is classed as organic because it's inorganic. So I really hope that helps with blueberries. They are worth it. They are the best fruit, and we've got I think 5 big blueberry plants. They grow to 5 foot by 5 foot at maximum height, and you do get a lot of, if they're happy plants, you get a lot of blueberries off them. So Susie has said, I have 2 raspberry plants in pots I'd like to plant in the allotment. When would be the best time to do it? In the sort of November, I think, for all types of fruit, really, somewhere between November and March. So you've got a nice window of opportunity. So yeah, they should be fine, just popped in the soil at any point. I wouldn't do it when it's like really heavy frost. You're better off doing it in November, so it's not frosty. T has asked if there's any particular blueberry varieties. We did a bit of a taste test this year of the different types that we've got. Now, I've really favoured one called Jersey for quite a while, and it's mainly because they're really big blueberries. They're quite late, and they're really easy to pick. Some blueberries are really small and fiddly, and just take a bit of a long time to pick when you've got quite a lot. So I really like Jersey, but then we did a taste test and my parents said that they were their least favourite. Now, I don't really notice too much if it's more flavour or less flavour because I mix them all together anyway. So I just think they're all lovely. I thought they were lovely anyway. Jersey, the flavour, I liked it. There was a really early one that we don't know what the variety is that we got given the plant. Yes, blueberry bush Jersey. Yeah, we've got it, Anita. She's put it in the chat. We had 3 bushes. The first 3 that we got were the, is it Greek, where you've got the months were called after Greek gods or something. You've got July, August and September, but it's the Greek word for it. And I remember Augustus. I can't remember the July and the September one, but they're supposed to be ripe in July, August and September. They're not. They're all ripe at the same time. But I've really enjoyed the August plant this year. I always liked the September one best because it was biggest, but that hasn't fruited very well the last couple of years. Whereas the August one, what I've noticed with actually the July and the August one, they're more fiddly to pick, but the payoff you get is they fruit for longer. So the August one I've been really happy with because it's got bigger fruit than the July and then it's fruited longer. So I think it's kind of, when you look at fruit, blueberry varieties, I think it's Chris Bowers and Sons has got a good variety of blueberries online, and you can look at each one and what the characteristics are. And when you look at them, some of them will be early, some of them will be late, some of them will be like, this is a really big fruit. I think with the bigger fruit, you get a little payoff in taste. They're not quite as tasty. Some of the more modern commercial varieties are easier to pick for obvious reasons. So I think whatever type you have, it's probably got a benefit somewhere. Either if it's smaller, but it might be more tasty, or it's harder to pick, but it fruits for longer and has an extended picking season. So I would get maybe 2 or 3 varieties, get an early one, a late one, and something else that takes your fancy, and then you'll hedge your bets. But yeah. Sorry, I don't know the Greek names of the August one, August or whatever it was. I think my stepdad's got a blue bear or something like that, or something like that sounded quite nice, but we haven't actually tried it yet. Okay. Any other questions on fruit? I think it's always better to go with questions on fruit because it's almost like an endless subject that I could do a whole hour and a half on its own if I was just left to my own devices. Do pop it in the chat if I move on and then you think, actually, I'd like to do I'm just going to flick through flowers for cutting because I used to do this as a vegetables and cut flowers talk, and I've cut it short because of time. So I'm just going to flick through, and you can see that these are all the sorts of things you're going to get in your standard bulb catalogue. If you like cut flowers, spring bulbs are just great. Yeah, they tend to be the showiest, nicest stand in a vase well flowers, I think. So Susie said, I've inherited a great strawberry bed and it's full to the brim with plants. Should I thin them or swap older plants for new? I would, next year, when you are looking at your plants and you're harvesting from them, then put a little marker, like a cane, like do some like sort of foot long canes with like a little red top or something, and mark out the plants that give you the best harvest, and or the ones that are rubbish, whichever way around you want to do it, and then just hoik them out after they finish, because yeah, you're right, the older plants don't harvest as well. But I've had a patch of strawberries for ages, and some of the older plants were surprisingly long lived and gave a really long crop for a while. So have a look at what you've got first, and then maybe take some runners and grow some plants especially that you know are definitely new plants, and then you can refresh the ones that you've pulled out. Also, if you with strawberries, they actually quite like being moved, because they like fresh nutrients. So if a bed's been in the same place for ages, it might have exhausted the nutrients. So it's a good idea to, as well as mulching with straw, the strawberries are actually the one plant that we are used to a mulch, aren't we? Because we mulch it with straw. But actually mulch it with compost first and then straw. Because I think probably municipal compost is what I'd go with because it's drier and it's not claggy like manure. I wouldn't want a fresh strawberry accidentally sitting on a bit of manure. It should be fine for both in theory. If you've got some nice well-rotted manure, it should be fine. But yeah, covering whatever compost or manure, and then in the spring, put your straw over that. So I'd actually mulch it with the compost or manure before the winter, so it's got time to get worked into the soil by the worms and things, and then mulch with straw in the spring, and then you'll probably get a better crop of the ones that you've actually got in the ground because you've fed them. Okay. So making leaf mulch. Now, making leaf mulch is great because leaf mulch is lovely to use. So the simplest way you can do it is just get some chicken wire and some posts, make a round netted circle, open top, fill it with leaves, and in about a year there'll be nice leaf mulch on. I recently found out that apparently comma butterflies overwinter as little, they look like leaves when they're folded up, and they hide in the leaf litter. So when we're raking up leaves, we could be removing butterflies, which I find quite horrendous. Also the leaves that are around a tree are actually feeding that tree. So if you keep taking the leaves from underneath the tree in your garden, you might be denuding it, the nutrients that it should be having back. So leaf mulch is a funny one now because I'm like, well, I love leaf mulch, so I definitely want some, but it's like, where do you take the leaves from? So last year I took them from round a tree where we'd sowed wildflower seeds and planted wildflower bulbs under, and I didn't want them to be completely covered by leaves. So I took them from that site because it was appropriate for that site. So yeah, just think a little bit where you're taking your leaves from. Try and take them from somewhere that's going to have to come off. Like if there's, somebody has to move them. But if there's any way that you can just leave your leaves be on the surface of the soil for the creatures that want to live there and the butterflies, then do. So yeah, just thought I'd go with that. So yeah, just finally, this is a list of the recipes that are on the notes that are on our website. So you go on ttw.org.uk, and all of those recipes are there. So if there's anything that takes your fancy and you want to see how it's made, then they're on there. And again, if you want to donate any recipes for us to add on, it's always nice to share it. I would say probably only a third of those recipes that I've actually cooked myself or I've put on there. Most of them have been donated over the years when we've been doing these veg talks. We've been doing them for quite a long time now. So yeah, it's really nice to share what we particularly like and what is really helpful for using up excess veg. So yeah. There's also some recipes in the summer notes as well. These are just the ones out of the autumn. Okay, so I hope that's been good. Is there any other questions before we round up? Oh, thank you.
Helen, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for coming. Thank you especially to you for this series of absolutely fantastic talks. They're so information packed. I don't know how you managed to get all of that into one head. And I would like to just invite everyone who's here to take themselves off mute and to sort of wave at us, because it's really nice to see people's faces and to feel like you're not just here
and do the next one and then
Yay.